From what I can gather about Turkey, when foreign capital comes in, that can obviously boost your exchange rate to start with. People are exchanging their inward flow into Turkish currency. But when they feel that the Turkish economy isn't doing what they want it to do, they start to sell their Turkish currency, and it drives the exchange rate down. The first academic paper I had published, I actually looked at this very issue, not about Turkey, but it's about Far East countries. And generally speaking, those countries that did not allow free capital mobility, they were selective in what they allowed, tended to do better. Because you can imagine a narrative, say you attract in foreign capital, maybe you've got like cheap workforce that come in, spend money in your country, buy your currency, which drives it up. Your ruling class thinks, great, our currency's worth a lot now. We're going to start buying stuff from foreign countries like palaces and weapons and stuff. We've got better credit, so we're going to borrow a load of dollars. Then when the bubble pops, the foreign capital all leaves, your currency crashes, you're left with massive foreign currency debts that you can't fund. So it's best not to have gone down that road. MMT perfectly well explains Turkey in terms of foreign currency debt. MMT is saying that government always spends through the issue of new currency. And also you should, as far as possible, avoid foreign currency debt.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economist and author Dr. Phil Armstrong. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about potential solutions to pandemic-related inflation and challenges faced by nations that have become dependent on foreign capital and foreign currency debt. If you're new to MMT, you might want to check out our first 3 episodes for an easy-to-understand introduction, but if you want to dive in here, you just heard Dr. Armstrong touch on the simple fact that governments that issue their own currencies spend by spending new pounds or dollars or yen or lira, etc., into existence using keystrokes at their central banks. So in short, governments like these are the source of their own spending money, which destroys the basis for austerity measures and helps us understand what's really going on when politicians cry poverty whenever they're asked to spend on anything that isn't a missile or a tax break for the 1%. The fact that governments issue their own spending money is not the end of the story. Of course, it's the beginning. It's the lens through which we can now view just about every phenomena impacting our political lives. Our money system is a policy tool designed to mobilize resources and to provision the public purpose. And just like any tool, it can be used or abused. And our podcast series is all about pointing the MMT lens at the real world to emphasize that in most cases, when it comes to government, better is possible and also happens to be vital to human life on Earth continuing. Before we dive in, some recommendations for newer listeners. Because governments not only can, but in actual fact every day do spend money into existence without operational limit, that's the only way governments with floating exchange rate currencies spend. Because we recognize this fact, we also recognize that inflation needs to be paid close attention to. And we've done many episodes on that topic. And so for more on inflation, you can listen to our episode 65 with Dr. Phil Armstrong or our episode 104 with Professor John T. Harvey. And for more on hyperinflation, you can listen to our episodes 88 and 89 with Dr. Armstrong and MMT founder Warren Mosler. You'll also hear us talk about the MMT Job Guarantee, which is MMT's policy prescription for price stability and full employment. In other words, it's a way to control inflation which doesn't throw anybody under the bus by forcing them into a buffer stock of involuntarily unemployed human beings having a miserable life or no life at all. For more on how that works, you can listen to our episodes 4 and 47. And if you're interested in the nuts and bolts of monetary operations, you can get into the weeds by listening to our episodes 13, 30, 31, 43, 84, and 86 in that order. I've linked to all of these things in the show notes for this episode, along with some other things that came up in the conversation, and to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino. Happy New Year.
And we are delighted to be joined once again today by our friend and your friend too, economist and author, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Thanks for joining us, Phil.
Great to be here again. Christian and Patricia, always a pleasure.
So let's get straight to it. At the moment, there's a lot of interest in and commentary on pandemic-related inflation around the world and proposals for how to tackle it. And The Guardian recently published what I think is a very level-headed opinion piece by Isabella Weber, who is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And it's entitled, "Could Strategic Price Controls Help Fight Inflation?" And so just to help us unpack that question, Phil, do you have any overarching comments about or feelings about strategic price controls before we dive in?
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that if you look at price controls, that they have a potential role to play in dealing with inflation. I'm not saying that, we need to have price controls on everything all the time. Like if you say, I agree that they've got a place, as you two are aware, some guy will write somewhere, MMTers think we should have price controls on everything. I mean, as was mentioned earlier. So I'm not saying that. It's just a matter of actually looking at what the cause of something is. So, you go to the doctors and you don't, they look at you, don't they, think, well, you're not feeling very well. Let's find out why you're not feeling very well. And then if they're not really sure, they might bring another doctor in and they'll have a look at you and they'll try and work out, and hopefully get it right to give you a potential means of dealing with the problem. So, for example, if we were to say, right, okay, prices are going up, and one of the reasons they are going up is because of market power, and price and profit margins are being increased by large oligopolistic businesses who are profiting from perhaps increased demand for certain products, and they are allowing their margins to go up by raising their prices. One might say quite reasonably that in that case, then, price controls are a good way. We should be saying to big businesses, who are likely to be the ones doing it in oligopoly, you shouldn't be able to raise your prices and exploit your market power, and price controls would be helpful in that case. Now, a lot of the time what you find is I don't know what you call them, free market zealots, the crazy gang. Now, what they've done is, and, Patricia will have come across this in her economic studies, in their mind, they've got a little demand and supply curve, haven't they? And they'll be thinking, well, if there's an increase in demand for something, then that will shift the demand curve along the supply curve, and the result of that will be a higher price, market price. And that will be what stimulates the extra production. So higher prices are some sort of market signal, that generates more output. And therefore, if the nasty old government, which is like gritting the machine, decides that it wants to put price controls on things, then it's just jamming this very delicately balanced free market system from allocating resources effectively. The problem is that we don't live in the textbook. We're not talking about putting price controls in free markets, if indeed free markets exist, or ones that demand and supply curves work in the way they say. We're talking about putting price controls on things for specific circumstances. And having read Isabella Weber's article, to me it seems perfectly reasonable that it's part of a suite of potential ways to dampen price increases that may or may not turn out to be short or medium term problems. So, in answer to the question, I was convinced by the merits of her argument. I think there are nuances in it that people will try and misinterpret deliberately or otherwise in order to try and criticise MMT without grounds.
Yes, but it's not as if she wrote that article for The Guardian and the word MMT doesn't appear anywhere in it anyway.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's just that, I think it seems sensible to people who grasp MMT that it depends. You know what I mean? It depends on where the inflation's coming from as to what tool you get out of the tool shed.
I think it's a very important debate because it goes to the heart really of how the two camps see the market. So if you see the market as all efficient and the best way to achieve optimum outcomes in the economy, then of course you're not going to want to interfere with that. And the pricing mechanism is the means by which, in their heads, the market does that. And let's face it, most people, that's their view of the market, because that's the popular view of economics that we have everywhere surrounding us, supply and demand. It gets ingrained in our heads from very early age. But, Stephanie Kelton and other non-mainstream economists, they see inflation as far more complex than that. They see inflation as an imbalance of power, and sometimes, not every time, but sometimes that imbalance of power needs to be addressed, particularly in the case that Phil mentions, but also particularly in those goods which are essential. So you might want rent controls, for example, in to prevent abuses of power. That's what it is. But of course, in the free marketeer's head, that doesn't exist. Everybody's equal in the market.
I guess you could say, in an environment that contains monopoly and oligopoly, not every price signal is the free market.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
And your problem there is, given that the world we live in is nearly all oligopoly, then isn't this sort of faith-like idea that, as Patricia said, there's some sort of allocation mechanism, isn't this really something you'd have to use very judiciously? So one interesting story, there was a question on an economics paper some years ago. It was like a year 12 paper, and it said use demand and supply diagrams to illustrate what would happen if McDonald's became more popular because they had better products as opposed to Burger King. So what the kids are supposed to do, and it seems incredible given it's an oligopoly market, was to draw two demand and supply curves, little crosses. So the demand curve goes to the right for McDonald's because it's more popular and goes to the left for Burger King. Even though there is no supply curve, it doesn't exist. It only applies in perfect competition. So the whole concept, so in other words, the question was designed to encourage young economists to apply demand and supply curves in every situation, even when the situation got nothing to do with supply and demand. And the funniest thing is, I wasn't a great student, this lad, but what he did was he didn't draw those two demand and supply curves as a pair. He actually drew a picture of McDonald's, nice brick building, and a picture of Burger King, and drew a stick man walking from one to another. And that was his illustration of the movement. It's actually more accurate than the demand and supply curves.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's like you said, this is the way people think, but it doesn't work like that. And if you think now you're getting all this stuff like, okay, we've got this inflation, what the Bank of England needs to be doing is increasing interest rates. This is the way to do it, one club golf and all that. Well, let's allow them a moment. Let's say they were right. And obviously, as MMTers, we know that, generally speaking, raising interest rates is actually inflationary, not deflationary. Well, let's say they were right, that if your inflation was due to too much demand, then maybe, you ought to do something with interest rates. But obviously, the inflation we've got now is primarily due to supply chain problems. It's on the supply side. So why would making firms' costs higher and discouraging them from improving those, why would that be in any way the right way to do it? And then when you bring in the actual reality that raising interest rates is actually inflationary, raising interest rates is exactly the worst policy you could do now to deal with any form of inflation. It's crazy. And so this whole idea of diagnosing where your problem lies with inflation, and obviously some people think that it's only temporary, others think it might be a bit longer term, but either way, raising interest rates is not the way to do it. And MMT tells us that. There's no rationale for that. It's, to me, mainly put forward by bankers, and Bill Mitchell points out, and bankers like that because higher interest rates enable the bank to make more profit. And obviously, if you're rich, you got a lot of money, you want higher interest rates because, surprise, surprise, any given amount of money will get you more money for doing nothing if you got a higher interest rate.
One question, because Noah Smith commented on Twitter about Stephanie Kelton's mention of price controls and inferred that it was MMT's flagship position that we should introduce price controls. And of course, we know that's nonsense. But it got me thinking about, where does that come from? When have we ever said, the state should use price controls as a primary means of controlling inflation? And if you think back, there is an essay called "The State as Price Setter," written by an MMTer, which has nothing to do with price controls, actually. But I just thought it was quite funny because, inadvertently, we may have given these people the impression that that's what we wanted to do, or maybe they're just, we're just assessing how things actually work in the government. That essay about price setting is about where does the price level originate and how things already work without having to instigate any new policy or anything like that. And some people just get really uncomfortable at that, don't you think?
If I was being generous, maybe they've misinterpreted this idea that the government naturally, as the monopoly issue of the currency, must set the rate of exchange for goods and services, like the absolute value of the currency. They might have misinterpreted that as some sort of advocacy for price controls. But I mean, if they have, they're not very clever. But I think it's more likely they just simply haven't bothered giving MMT a fair hearing. And as we've said before, I think a lot of the time we have got the mainstream on the run, and they are deliberately mischaracterizing MMT now anyway, because they're trying to discredit it. They can't do it properly. They can't take MMT on head on. So they're actually deliberately mischaracterizing it. They're creating like a straw man version of MMT, because they think they can burn that down, In
case anybody is new to MMT and they've just dived in on this episode, our last episode, which was a conversation with Warren Mosler, the founder of MMT, was all about how the government, as the issuer of currency, has no choice but to be the setter, the communicator of absolute value, because it is the only issuer of the thing that it demands for payment of taxes. So when it spends, it is saying, for instance, if it employs a soldier, 50 grand a year, it is saying, a year's worth of soldering is worth 50 grand. So, and then every other thing that it buys, right down to a box of pencils, is communicating a piece of information about what the currency is worth. What other things are worth against the currency. And so on a point of logic, if they start paying more for the same thing tomorrow, then they are revising the value of their currency downward. So that's it in a nutshell. And it takes a fair bit of listening to and re-listening to and reading and rereading, but that is the overarching view about how the government is sets the absolute value of its currency that it issues. So we've got that. That's the MMT. That's what the MMT lens tells you about the source of the price level. The source of the price level is a function of prices paid by government when it spends, and just to add in brackets, or collateral demanded when it lends. So we've got the MMT view there. Now let's have a look at this real situation that the world's going through. We've got a truck driver shortage over here in Britain. I think perhaps still Brexit played a part in feeding into that, and they had to change the rules to sort of ease that truck driver shortage. You've got the pent-up demand, people who were being paid to shelter in place. You've got, even before the pandemic, you've got the just-in-time production approach, which completely breaks down when you hit a bump like COVID-19. So that's where all these sort of supply chain bottlenecks are coming from, and that's what's causing the inflation.
Well, it's just to clarify, it's the just in time, but done wrong. So
sure, okay, right.
It's departed from its original intent, and is about reducing inventories as much as possible. That's what made us vulnerable. Lay
that out. Lay out how it looks when it's done correctly.
I think the idea was that the just in time was about efficiency, but it was also about not exposing yourself to undue risk. So of those components that you might have, that may be more difficult to source, it would have been wise to keep some inventory, not a lot of inventory, but some inventory in case of an eventualities like this one. And when the West kind of adopted the just-in-time mentality, they adopted it without due consideration for those safeguards. So inventories cost money. So the West basically just took that idea to an extreme and reduced inventories to an absolute minimum, and that made everything just more vulnerable.
Got it. So we've got this real situation that's causing some prices to rise, meat, medicines, some household products. You've got this semiconductor chip shortage that's driven up the price of new automobiles and other vehicles. And so those are prices going up. And somebody comment on one of our episodes, it was perhaps the Warren Mosler episode, the most recent one. Look, if the government is the price setter, why can't it just tackle inflation that way?
Let's just think about in terms of in theory first, and then we'll compare that. What the government could say, right, okay, everything we buy, we're going to hold our price at the level we pay now. Labour, resources, everything it buys. Now, thing is, let's say there's a shortage of a particular product or something the government was buying, and the private sector had to pay more to get that, etc. The price would obviously, the price they'd have to charge to make a profit might be above the price the government's offering. So initially, then, in the private sector, they would look for alternative sellers. So imagine in the world, everyone's thinking, well, the government won't buy what we want, so we'll sell it to someone else. Now, that might work for a while in the abstract, but after a while, if no one's selling to the government, they're all selling to other private sector sellers, no one's getting enough state money of the government to pay their taxes. So they're all having to drain their net saving of previous tax money to pay their tax bill. And eventually everybody will get so poor that they would actually have to, if you like, now start selling to the government. So in principle, the government, if you like, because it sets the whole structure, it's much easier for the government to drive inflation just by offering higher and higher prices. Given it's the currency issue, it can do that. But it can engender deflation or halt the price level going up by simply refusing to increase any of its prices. But as you can imagine, in practice, that's going to have a huge braking effect, isn't it, on the whole of the private sector economy. So the most practical way of dealing with inflation, which is general rise in prices, is just to choose one product, the most fundamental product. And that, of course, would be like your buffer stock product on which everything else is built, labour. So what the government does, of course, as you guys know well, and many of the listeners will know, is the job guarantee. So basically, there's a buffer stock of employed labour, and that acts as, if you like, the product on which everything else is based. So that sets the absolute value of the currency, what the government will pay for basic labour in the job guarantee. And everything moves around that. Now, within that system, of course, right, you might think, well, won't prices change then? Yeah. So if there is a shortage of a given product, then that product might go up in price. But it's not inflation, because inflation has to be sustained. So there has to be some sort of mechanism for it to be inflation, like a wage price spiral. So if there's a shortage of, I don't know, semiconductors, the price of semiconductors goes up, but then obviously people sort out their processes and then their supply mechanisms. That the price mechanism solves that in the next period. It's not really inflation as such. It doesn't perpetuate itself. So what I'm saying is, having this price anchor of the job guarantee stabilizes prices. And the idea that if you have one-off changes in prices of individual products, that's just how the price mechanism's supposed to work. Now, if we go right back to your first question, which is about, well, yeah, but hang on a minute. Sometimes when prices go up, it's not because, there's a shortage of something. It's because, oligopoly firms are exploiting the situation. So that's when you need this range of products. So what you're really doing then, it's a difficult thing managing the economy. You recognize ultimately the government is setting prices. It doesn't want to set everything because it's going to jam up the whole system. So it's going to set one basic price, the job guarantee. Others are based on that. If you've got concerns that you've got problems like maybe loose credit standards leading to credit bubbles, you deal with that by regulation. If you feel that oligopoly firms are exploiting the situation, they put price controls on. So that's how I would, if you like, think about the package, that it's complicated. But it does rely on people giving like MMT a fair hearing, not taking things out of context and trying to be ridiculous. MMT is explaining how the system works, but then developing the right policies based on those insights is complicated. And it's like the old example of Copernicus. Once he showed it was the sun at the middle of the solar system, not the Earth, it wasn't the end of astronomy, was it? It's the beginning. Once people understand MMT, we don't all put our feet up, close all the textbooks and go, it's a wonderful world. The government just keys millions of pounds in the economy every day and we'll all be brilliant. No one's saying that, despite what all those crazy guys who write on Forbes or the FT say. That's just frames the problem. Then the hard work starts. When we have inflation, it's not because the government's running a massive deficit necessarily, or the government's printing too much money. It could have all manner of causes, and that's where clever people have to deal with it. And I think Warren talks about this idea of competence. You know, you need competent politicians with competent advisors who understand the system to actually run the economy effectively. And when you've got a whole load of people like who don't really know very much, who are influencing it, like these writers in the financial press who continue to write of MMT not being the answer, printing money, and all the stuff that you guys have come across so often, it's so counterproductive and disingenuous, really. All MMT really needs is a fair hearing.
There is a contradiction at the heart of their argument, which is, I think, pinned in ideology, kind of based on ideology, because to the mainstream, you know, all inflation basically is excessive demand. So you fix it all by reducing demand, either by, you know, increasing interest rates or by reducing government spending, you know. And but they do acknowledge that, you know, credit issuance can create productive capacity and therefore be deflationary if it is, you know, if it's going towards investment. But they do not assign the same value to government investment. So only the private sector can invest in a way that is wise, and all government spending is inherently inflationary because it's inefficient.
Yes, and that's because they call all government spending of all types in the mind of a mainstreamer, exactly, is classed as consumption. So, you know, if the government builds a school, that's consumption. But if a private sector builds a school and runs it as a business, that's investment. It's all built on this ideology.
But it's very subtle, isn't it? I mean, it's not explicitly said, it's just implied.
It's the greatest problem, I guess, in a sense, that people have this idea of the money story, and the money springs, and is this idea that money springs up in the private sector at some dim point in the past, you know, develop some barter, you know, and the government comes along late and nicks some of it in taxes to buy things with. And it gives the idea that the government sector is some sort of parasitical structure on, like some sort of fungus on the side of a tree, you know? Whereas obviously in reality, the whole idea of the monetary system comes from the state. And being able to run a private sector business is in fact a privilege, not a right. If you can run a business and make profits while paying your workers well, a good wage, protect the environment, you know, think about future generations, be innovative, that's great. But if you can't do that, if you can't produce goods and services environmentally, sustainably, look after your workers, you know that being disruptive, then to me, you exit the industry. It's a privilege that you're granted by the community. And I think once you understand that, you turn things on its head, you begin to understand how the system actually is. Whereas obviously the mainstream is thinking a completely different way. They think that everything comes from the private sector and the government is like a siphoner of real resources from that productive capability.
So we've got these real world problems that manifest as inflation, and the way we do, all the countries that have floating exchange rate currencies, the way we do economic management in most of these places is still this thing we call monetary policy and not much else. So that we've just got this one tool in the tool shed, and therefore in December, for instance, over here in Britain, the Bank of England raised interest rates. So just to contrast the MMT approach with the mainstream approach, and we touched on this a little before, but what does mainstream neoclassical economics tell us will happen if the central bank raises interest rates?
Well, in theory, is going to prevent or discourage people from borrowing money and they consider the consumption aspect of borrowing to be dominant here. And that is going to decrease demand, and therefore inflation will come down. That's what they think will happen.
And I mean, this has been the only game in town for decades, right?
Yeah. I think an increasing number of economists do know something is off. They just don't have better tools. They don't have anything better, basically. So they just keep doing the same thing.
So in pursuit of better, the MMT take on interest rates and their impact on inflation is? That
is going to increase the price of futures. That is going to increase the interest rate income to the private sector for that debt which is held by the private sector, and that could potentially have an inflationary effect as opposed to the counter deflationary effect that they're looking for.
Yeah, and it's like it's a very easy choice, I think. That one thing you can stop doing, currency issuer, aka the government, is stop giving people who already have money free money via the interest income channel, which is where the idea of ZIRP comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think Warren also says it's higher interest rates, free money for the rich, people who already have money, absolutely. So, I mean, if you wanted to make, I suppose, things you could do to make inflation less likely, well, obviously you should have a productive economy, shouldn't you, that's flexible and can respond as well as possible to increases in demand, because you've got the supply potential to do that. So you need a healthy economy, fully employed, able to produce plenty of products in a green and sustainable way. So that would be a good way of helping future reductions in inflation. Keep interest rates, the risk-free interest rate at zero. So you're not giving free money, as Patricia eloquently said, get the interest rate mechanism the right way around. Another thing you would do is very, very carefully monitor private exploitation of oligopoly power, which tends to push prices up when there is no reason for that to happen. The other thing is try to prevent banks or the way banks operate fueling asset bubbles by the reduction of credit standards. It's not about the price of credit, it's the standards involved in credit. We all know about in the subprime crisis, lending being, given out inappropriately, etc. So in terms of dealing with the economy in the longer term, you've got your price anchor through the job guarantee. You've got a productive economy on the supply side. And one thing I would say as well is, why do you need very complicated supply chains, where, you've got like people sending something all over the world to try and save a little bit of money? Because as we know, as Patricia mentioned, with our approach to just in time, if one of those chains snaps, and with pandemics and other things, then suddenly you run out of stuff and prices go up. So let's try and shorten supply chains if we can. That's also very, very good for environmental sustainability and green issues. So there's so many ways we can try to protect the economy against inflation. And by that, I mean this idea of the price goes up and then other factors sustain it. So it's like a perpetuating process that's sustained over time. You'll always get an odd price going up now and again, another price going down, and maybe the price level might go up and down a bit. That's just the way economics works. Inflation's something bigger than that. It has to be sustained. And this idea of, these central bank, not so much central bank, but certainly bankers, if they say, an increase in a price index going up 3%, and they all run around pressing the big red panic button. We need to put interest rates up. I mean, I think we mentioned a couple of weeks or a few weeks ago that's just because they all think if the inflation's gone up, the value of my large money in the bank's gone up. I want interest rates to go up to maintain the value of my bank account. They're not really thinking about the effect on the rest of the economy. So I think we need to be concerned about inflation, when it's really inflation. But we need to be thinking about it much more broadly and also in a green and a sustainable way. You know, this like all answer the one pump we've got, like you said, Christian, put interest rates up. It's the wrong policy anyway. So they've only got one club in their golf bag, and unfortunately, the club's broken and works in reverse. Apart from that, perfect.
Speaking of the Bank of England, have any of you heard about the Bank of England is publishing a new book? They call it a pop economics in the sense that it's sort of an economics book aimed for lay people.
Yeah, I mean, you've got people like, you know, Bill Mitchell started his blog. Was it like getting on for 2 decades ago now? When he started out, you know, a lone voice. Obviously, you know, Warren again, a lone voice. Just, you know, they've won over the sort of neophytes. And then now, you know, Stephanie's brought in this book that people who are like, you know, later adopters, you know, people who like want to see something proven before they go, all right, I'm going to jump in with both feet. She's now got this New York Times bestseller book, The Deficit Myth, and that's for those people. And I think the mainstreamers see that they're on their way out, and you know, oh, okay, well, we better tell the story our way before the opportunity passes by to actually tell the story our way. I think that's probably what's going on.
It's like when Rishi Sunak comes out in a video saying the state has no money, basically repeating what Thatcher said 30 years ago. When I don't remember the last time I heard it before he said it, and so the timing just seems spot on.
The 80s are back.
It makes me feel we're doing something right.
It seems to me, fitting in with what you guys are saying, there's some sort of policy of containment in the sense that, like, when MMT came along, they kind of ignored it, never heard of it. Then the next thing was to sort of ridicule it. But the problem with it is, from their point of view, that it's obviously got something in it because it won't go away and it seems to get things right. So in a way, what they have to do then is compartmentalize it. So you'll say, yeah, MMT is true that, you know, when you've got plenty of spare capacity, you can spend a little bit more and you'd pick something up and they've got that little thing right. But it's just in a little box and you mustn't, you know, don't get on board their little raft, which is going to sink. We've got the ocean liner, you know, and the problem is, of course, their ocean liner's the Titanic. But it's the next stage. And I think what's happened with things like, you know, the Bank of England's 2014 article, occasionally they like give a little bit of way, give a little bit of concession. But then after that, they shut the door and say, right, we've done that, you know, we'll put that in its box. Yeah, you were quite clever. You got something we hadn't stressed enough. You know, we're on the Titanic. There's no hole in it. And it's going to get all the way to New York. Don't get in any lifeboats. You don't need to.
So getting back to Professor Weber's Guardian article about price controls, I think she sums it up by saying, look, there's an option. The government could target specific price rises that drive inflation instead of moving to austerity, which risks a recession. Or the other one was just to act as if it's going to be transitory, and then it turns out to not be transitory. So she's saying the third option is, and she uses a metaphor for strategic price controls, which I like, so I'm going to say it. If your house is on fire, you would not want to wait until the fire eventually dies out. Neither do you want to destroy the house by flooding it. A skillful firefighter extinguishes the fire where it is burning to prevent contagion and save the house. And and then she says history teaches us that such a targeted approach is also possible for price increases.
Going back to this idea of competency, you just like to think, that your firefighter knows what to do with your house. You know, that if there's more than one fire extinguisher, you know, you don't put the wrong one on. That this one club golf thing, all press the interest rate button. You would hope that people in politics, people in economics understood the multiple complexity of the forces which may have inflationary potential, accepting. And so if you thought things were likely to be semi-permanent, they were the result of oligopolistic exploitation, you would use the appropriate tools. If you make your best judgment, based on an MMT-informed lens, that it was a transitory process, then I think you wouldn't need to do so. But it's all about that, MMT sets the backdrop for your thinking, I
genuinely think that a lot of economists just simply do not have a different mental tool at their disposal in order to see inflation in a different light. I think that there's a lot of well-intentioned people out there who genuinely, care a lot about the outcomes for vulnerable people, but a lot of them are simply not equipped with the theoretical tools to be able to present alternative.
Daniela Gabor quote tweeted an article about the recent violent protests in Kazakhstan, and that's unfolding even as we record. And it started with demonstrations in response to fuel price rises. The article has kind of got like a flaming overturned truck, and her comment was, "Oh look, lifting strategic price controls can topple governments." And another person on Twitter, Jim O'Reilly, commented, "Look, we have price control either way. It's either by a public authority theoretically representing the democratic will, or as it is now, corporate oligopolies / monopolies representing consolidated wealth." I think that's pretty much it, really.
In that article that you shared earlier, there was talk about the use of price controls in World War II.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what economists think about what that was for. And I know that in the UK, I'm not sure if there were price controls, but there were controls on, for example, on unions negotiating increased wages. They said whatever increase in wages you have, you're going to have it as postponed kind of wages, right? Instead of taxing you, that's what we're going to do.
So you're not losing it forever.
Yeah, and there were like welfare considerations and equality considerations, and Keynes, in his book about how to fund the war, he outlines that we could see the war as an opportunity to achieve greater equality that we have been capable of in the past, and these are the sort of measures that he uses to achieve it. He prefers not to tax workers, but to postpone their spending. But inflation control was incredibly important. And I don't know if you remember, Christian, when Sam Levy was talking to us, he mentioned that they found later that some tactics of the Germans against the French was to drop fake notes and things like that in order to trigger inflationary pressure.
Inflate the currency, yeah.
And inflation in the middle of the war would have made it more difficult for governments to continue to mobilize resources for the war, which is why inflation control was so important. So in a time when inflation control was so important and high productivity was so important, if you had price controls there, at least some kind of price controls, then why are price controls so bad?
Yeah, that's when you need the economy to work the best, isn't it? The stakes are that high. I was just going to say, Jamie Galbraith, when he responded to Krugman's criticism, basically Krugman saw this op-ed by Professor Weber and said, this is, I think he used the word idiotic. And a lot of people underneath shared a screen grab of him tweeting in favor of price controls in like March, April 2020. This anyway, Jamie Galbraith responded to Krugman's thread, which he's now deleted. Part of the thread reads, "The point of strategic price control in 1946 and now was to prevent an outbreak of inflation followed by a loss of purchasing power and confidence. A further purpose now, not relevant yet in 1946, is to forestall counterproductive hikes in interest rates by the Federal Reserve." And then he goes on to say, by releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and by intervening in the ports, the Biden administration has shown that it understands the critical role of key prices and is acting directly to bring them down. Weber's argument is in full sympathy with the selected policy. So, I think to answer the question posed at the beginning of our op-ed, could strategic price controls help fight inflation? I think we're saying yes.
When you're saying about the World War II thing, if you think about that, it's quite interesting how obviously if you're fighting at the front, and you find that your wife and your kids can't get any food because there's no price controls and there's not enough food available, and the rich people can buy everything and bid prices up, you have to have price controls to protect, if you like, the distribution of limited resources. Well, in a sense, that's kind of what we're saying here. What's really happening is that oligopoly businesses are profiting from price rises. They're just taking out, I think I read something about record prices, record profits. I don't know whether it was in the same article by Isabella Weaver.
It was in the Guardian.
And that in it. So all that's really happening is, forget about all that, this idea of this mythical demand and supply. We're damaging the ability of the price mechanism to, it's not about that. It's about counterbalancing oligopoly power. This mythical market doesn't exist. The oligopolies are simply driving up prices to make more, to draw more real resources to themselves. In the same way, in like World War II, if you had no rationing, for example, those people who got lots and lots of money would obviously buy most of the stuff, including the food. And if you're a soldier at the front, my wife can't feed my kids, I'm off up sticks and home, aren't you? I'm not saying it'd be that easy, but you have to have a sense of togetherness, in times of trouble. And obviously we haven't got huge inflation, but it's time to sort of clamp down on profiteering, which is essentially what's happening. And I mean, one thing that you may have come across is these sort of right-wing arguments in favour of price gouging. Yeah, this idea, there's a great shortage of something like fresh water, so people might have been paying £2 for a bottle of water. Then, there's a great shortage and people start selling for £50 a bottle. Well, that's good because it's the market equilibrium price and it'll encourage more bottled water to arrive in the area where everyone's all dying of thirst. Well, first of all, it means all the rich people who've got the money can buy loads of water, so they're all right. And then, obviously, the companies are making massive profits on selling the water. And what about the poor people who've all died of thirst by the water gets there, And there are people who actually say price gouging is good, And really, it's just, to me, whether they know it or not, they're just defending the status quo.
So turning the corner, we've got Turkey. And in a recent blog post, Bill Mitchell spells it out in the title. Turkey tells us nothing about MMT, but MMT tells us a lot about why Turkey is in trouble. So, Phil, in your view, why is Turkey in trouble?
Well, from what I can gather about Turkey, in common with a lot of countries like out in the Far East and maybe in Latin America, they swallowed the IMF line. It's good to have free capital mobility. So what they did was they allowed a lot of foreign capital to move into Turkey because this is supposed to be good foreign investment. So that's flooding into the country. The problem is that when foreign capital comes in, that can obviously boost your exchange rate to start with, because obviously people are exchanging their inward flow of foreign money into Turkish currency. But when they feel that they perhaps have made a mistake or the Turkish economy isn't doing what they want it to do, then, of course, they start to sell off their Turkish currency, and it drives the exchange rate down. Now, what Turkey had done is, at that point, it started borrowing. I think it's got a very large amount, and obviously Bill's article spells out the details, very large amount of foreign currency debt. And obviously to pay, say it was dollars or euros, the Turkish government can't issue those. It can only issue Turkish lira. So as a nation, they've got to acquire the money required, the foreign currency, to pay the foreign currency debt. And when, of course, it looks as though they can't do that, people start to panic. Dealers were starting to sell off Turkish lira, and it starts to fall in value. So obviously what was supposed to be then the only result was supposed for the Turkish economy to drive up interest rates to sort of make itself more attractive to foreign investors. MMT has always said that it's a bad idea to run up foreign currency debts. Obviously, there are countries in the world where, let's say you had a country, was very, very real resource poor, wasn't a tourist country, even if they had, an MMT-informed policies, they were trying to work full employment, they were invested in their workers, they still couldn't produce enough fuel or food to feed themselves, then they may be in trouble. If foreign countries wouldn't be prepared to save in their currency, they might have to borrow in foreign currency. But that is, if you like, something to be avoided. Now, unfortunately, Turkey has done that. Obviously, they've got problems with foreign currency debt, and they're reaping the after effects of that. I did notice that Bill had said that the government had managed to compensate dealers for falls in the lira, and they'd managed to get the currency to go back to a level that it was at previously. So, interestingly enough, you have to work out, and as Bill points out, what the right, inverted comma, level of the lira is. So it may well that the lira was at quote-unquote too high a level. So obviously when it's attracting all the foreign currency in to start with, that's going to drive the lira up, maybe to an unsustainable level. So when all the foreign capital leaves, it's going to driving it down again. So the first actual academic paper I had published, which is some time ago, I actually looked at this very issue, not about Turkey, but it's about Far East countries. And generally speaking, those countries that did not allow free capital mobility, that's not to say they wouldn't let foreign capital come in, but they were selective in what they allowed, tended to do better. Because you can imagine a narrative, can't you, where say you were attracting foreign capital, maybe you've got like cheap workforce that come in, spend money in your country, buy your currency, which drives it up. So then your ruling class thinks, great, our currency's worth a lot now. We're going to start buying stuff from foreign countries like palaces and weapons and stuff. And also because our currency's going up, we've got better credit, so we're going to borrow a load of dollars. Then when the bubble pops, the foreign capital all leaves, your currency crashes, you're left with massive foreign currency debts that you can't fund. So it's best not to have gone down that road. And I know Bill's going back to Turkey, which I know less about, the same basic pattern, huge foreign currency debts, which should be, as I say, sometimes unavoidable to an extent. And we need sort of multinational real resource transfers. But by and large, if you can avoid foreign currency debt, you should be doing that. MMT, if you read it fairly, and I'm going back to this idea of fair reading, you would understand that MMT perfectly well explains Turkey's errors in terms of foreign currency debt. And I think, going back to the key point, most of the harsh critics of MMT who haven't read it tend to say, oh, well, MMT is just suggesting when you've got spare capacity, you spend a load of money. But if you keep on doing that, what will happen is your exchange rate will crash and then you'll get very high inflation because of that and you'll be in trouble. Look at Turkey. But MMT doesn't say that. MMT is saying that government always spends through the issue of new currency, as you said. And that if, as far as is possible, it should avoid free capital mobility, obviously be selective, and also you should, as far as possible, avoid foreign currency debt. That's my understanding of the Turkey situation.
One of the interesting points from Bill's article on Turkey is that he says, well, the president of Turkey thinks that the interest rate should be lowered in order to help farmers and basically increase productivity. Whereas mainstream economists are, screaming that interest rates need to rise in order to attract, foreign money to buy Turkish bonds, presumably, and fix the exchange rate that way.
The question really, should you be saying to yourself, right, we're going to constantly raise interest rates, cripple our domestic economy, and as MMT says, cause more inflation in order to make your currency more attractive to foreign capital, who will leave you at the drop of a hat? So it's like a drug addict, isn't it? Where you say, like, let's raise the interest rate to attract in more capital. But once you've got that, as soon as you do anything to stimulate the economy, it's all going to leave. So in a sense, you might just have to accept we're not going to do that. There may be a fall in the exchange rate if we do depress the interest rate. But I mean, I've not heard of that till Bill said about it, how compensating the lira losses was really clever, it seemed to me. And it just seemed to halt the precipitous decline of the lira. And so it has to find its correct level. And this idea of, to me, constantly trying to raise interest rates in order to attract in so-called hot money or foreign capital, it's a road to nowhere, isn't it? Because when will it all end? You've got to wean yourself off foreign capital.
They're going to have to go cold turkey.
Yes, exactly.
Sorry, I'm just cracking myself up here.
That was too good.
If you look at Turkey as an economy, not the bird we eat at Christmas, it would seem, I'm not an expert, as I said, but it seems to me a country that's got potential if it had a more efficient economic structure, if it had maybe a more democratic and more efficiently run governmental system. So, you know what I mean? It's this idea of we're going to rely on foreign capital. It's not a good long-term solution. And to say that MMT is suggesting that is just disingenuous in the extreme. And I think Bill always gets it in these things spot on.
I think his point is very similar to the circumstances that you might find in Peru as well, because he mentions that if a country bases all their growth strategy on exports, and the main means of financing that kind of exports, and by financing I mean obtaining machinery in order to grow your industries, is to borrow in dollars or in another foreign currency, then if that's your main growth strategy, it will leave you very vulnerable to world prices of those exports. So if the price of something that is a key export to your country suddenly collapses, that's just going to have an immediate effect on the exchange rate.
Yeah, I remember the thing I looked at was Thailand, which is a similar thing. The baht went up a lot when they opened up to foreign capital. And obviously you get a lot of investment. They got a lot of investment in Thailand, I don't know, it was 20 years ago or something. And obviously once the value of the currency goes up, the powers that be feel that they're in a position where they can build stuff and, make themselves in a stronger position. But once the products they were exporting fall in price, as Patricia said, they've then land with a whole load of foreign currency debts. And once the exports from Thailand start to fall, all the foreign capital leaves. So really, you're sort of attracting in unwanted visitors that may kind of give you a short-term benefit, but in the long term, it's too dangerous a deal. So, I think this idea of Turkey of reducing interest rates to support their farmers, this is a good idea. Let the exchange rate go down if it must. Obviously, there are ways that they seem to have devised to prevent a precipitous fall. And don't buy into the whole IMF, allow free capital mobility. It's the best thing since sliced bread, because it's not. Before we go,
there's lots to look forward to in 2022, not least a paper on hyperinflation in Peru by this new heterodox economics upstart called Patricia Pino. But there's also a new MMT book on the horizon being put together by you, Phil, and our friends at the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies. Any update on that? Can you tell us how that's shaping up?
Well, Mark, who hopefully you'll be able to speak to in the future, Mark Epstein, he's a very creative guy. He's helping with cover design and the sort of aesthetic elements of it with me this evening. And then we're going to meet up with the whole GIMS team within 2 or 3 weeks. And all being well, we're going to have a draft manuscript put together within 3 or 4 weeks. So we've made a lot of progress since last we speak. We've got nearly all the chapters in now. I think we're only waiting for 2. So we're moving forward. It's very exciting. We've got a Warren, we've got a Bill, we've got a Randy Ray, plus many, many others, Neil and the boys. Neil's been fantastic. I think he's delivered a share of 3, one of which is his own. So he's the main man in that. But fabulous, and it's going to be a great, great book.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Lots to look forward to. We've been talking to Dr. Phil Armstrong, economist and author of Can Heterodox Economics Make a Difference? And obviously organizer of the new Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies book. And we'll link to all things Phil in the show notes. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
Thanks for having me, Christian, Patricia. All the best for 2022.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.